Here comes the nasty gram.
Send a priest to save my soul, forget it.
Welcome back to the Nastagram RPG podcast. This is our Game Master Roundtable about fantasy tabletop gaming, Dungeons and Dragons versus the world.
Too hard is the poison to the heart of a cynic.
Well, hello and welcome back to the Nastagram RPG podcast for a special Game Master Roundtable. Special. This is Josh, and today I am joined by...
Hey everyone, it's Dan.
Hey, this is Devin.
This is Jake.
This is Matt.
And I also want to introduce a special guest, first time on the Nastagram RPG podcast, a podcast, an internet friend from north of the border, our friend Andrew from the X-Files. This Is Not Happening, another X-Files podcast. Hi, Andrew.
Hello, everybody. Such a pleasure to see your shining faces.
Yes, it is nice. We did our first podcast together when I was on the X-Files podcast, which actually I don't think has released yet.
It has not yet released. Possibly in the next 2 weeks, I think. 4 weeks, if I remember correctly, the schedule.
But we had gotten chatting since then, and I didn't know that you had as much of a game background. And as we sort of discussed wanting to get another one of these in, it seemed a perfect opportunity to invite you. So without any further ado, if you didn't read the title of the fucking episode, which I don't know what it's going to be, something about fantasy role-playing games. Basically...
Like sexy ones?
Sexy time.
Okay, great. Cool.
Sexy fantasy role-playing. How to bring the spice back to your love life.
Yeah.
Strict role-playing games.
So we're talking about fantasy tabletop, basically, or calling it D&D versus the world. So we are going to talk a little bit about different systems. We're going to talk about our experience with them, talk about different things we like. And before we kind of really get into the meat of it, wanted to go around really quick and just give your personal 30-second or so background on what first brought you to tabletop fantasy games, what systems you've played, and if you've played or run them. Andrew, who's our guest, would you like to start us off, sir?
Sure. I prompted by your suggestion of this question, I actually did a little catalog and timetable, and I realized it's been a long time. I'm older than I look. So it's been 38 years that I've been playing.
Fuck.
I know, it's been a long time. And basically all the games, I think, is the answer. But lots of Dungeons and Dragons, because everyone seems to start that way. But also big into the Vampire/World of Darkness series, most of the games in there. Call of Cthulhu, it's a big time into that one as well. Star Wars, but not the newer ones, actually. And Champions, special place in my heart, the old comic book role-playing game. Yeah, that was interesting.
Is that Marvel or DC or both? Or
Neither, actually.
Neither.
It predated DC Heroes and Marvel. I forget the
Mutants
name of
and Masterminds? Was that theirs?
That was another one. Yeah, Villains and Vigilantes was another comic book superhero role-playing game. But no, what I liked about Champions, and I think it actually was the one that followed D&D, was it was a point system. So you actually built your character with points.
okay.
And it was a real slap in the face to, the DM said, 3 dice 6 for each stat. And the stat you get is as you rolled them. So this way you could actually get the character you wanted as opposed to your, thief with 13 dexterity.
And this is a good reason to bring in guests, we realized, because as much as, we have a fair bit of role-playing experience between most of us, those of us that have been playing together the longest have a fairly small amount, a narrow sampling of systems. So,
And it's all identical. I mean,
it's
Josh,
essentially
you might as
identical.
well say your experience, and then Dan and I will just say, and that is
That's the
us.
same thing. Right.
Well, I've already talked too much, so why don't you do it?
Go ahead, Dan.
Grew up with D&D, obviously the Kickstarter. I think maybe starting with like reading fantasy books and then finding a peer group that played, obviously allowed. I think Hayden was the one that introduced it to Cooper and Cooper to me and you to Josh and the rest of us really. And then from that, I think as we got a little older, we jumped into Vampire, World of Darkness, and Star Wars was there, the D6. We never really, as you kind of mentioned, Andrew, that the newer systems never really grabbed hold of us. It was always D6 for us, the West End. And then we've kind of played a smattering of the new stuff more recently from, I'm looking at our shelf right now, Scum and Villainy, a lot of the Fate Core stuff, Monster of the Week, and what's the Dungeon
World.
Dungeon World is the other. We're still trying to break into Shadowrun and Cyberpunk, but we have not cracked those. Did you ever do those, Andrew?
I did a little Shadowrun. I think we tried Cyberpunk. But the problem with those games, I mean, we can delve into these games as much or as little as you want, but it seemed to me the problem was there was always the characters that were feet on the ground and doing all the running and shooting stuff, and then there was always the decker. And it's okay, you've got this game where they're going to go do something cool with shooting and fighting, and then you got the decker, and there was a constant split focus. So I think there was a lot of finger tapping.
I always thought that the intention was to do the sort of George Lucas, like we're going to have three sort of separate battles going on simultaneously. And if you can pull it off, it does make for like a cool narrative, but it probably gets old pretty quick, especially if it's only one character doing half of the
We were just
things.
talking about this in the fantasy setting, how the scout character is sometimes very hard to play.
Yeah,
because
usually better to have as an NPC.
Yeah. Right. But that's sort of... that encapsulates a lot of what Josh, Jake, and
Jake.
Yeah.
Same.
Yeah.
Matt?
Yeah, I mean, I'm probably the newest to all of this. I started with, watching Critical Role when it first started airing and was like, oh, I've always wanted to do that. And then kind of found my way into playing with these guys. And I think if you listen to the podcast, you've pretty much heard me experience all the systems that I've played. Some of them first time. So I apologize.
When Matt and I lived together and I walked back in the apartment and I did like a double take and I'm like, are you watching Dungeons and Dragons? Like, A, I didn't know that was a thing.
Right.
And B, I didn't know you had any idea of it. So yeah.
It's always fun. when you kind of, that subject kind of just gets tickled. Like it happened to me the other day. And someone was like, oh, you're in a podcast? I'm like, yeah, it's super nerdy. And he's like, oh yeah, what is it? And he was like, Dungeons and Dragons. He's like, yeah, my wife runs a lot of games. And I'm like, and it's like, did we just become best friends?
Our other friend Matt always had the joke of dropping the Thaco bomb. Like if you're in a conversation with someone that you suspect might, be cool, then you just randomly drop the word Thaco into the conversation.
Cool. the old school. Yeah. It starts the same way. If someone is going to tell an awful sexist joke, it's desperately looking around for women listening. All right. And Devin, your experience, sir.
My experience is a little different. I did start with D&D Pathfinder First Edition sort of concurrently. I was playing both games a little bit at college, play tested 5th edition. I played some 4th edition with the online character creator.
So you're the one.
Yes, it's great. It's really good. In the 4th edition stuff, there's a small niche group on the internet that sticks to the 4th edition stuff. And I think I want to talk about that a little later, is sort of the character powers that you have are very cool, sort of narratively exciting. But we can get into that later. I've played a couple of the D6 systems. Monster of the Week I've played. Dungeon World I've played and run. But more recently I've been getting into Delta Green, which is sort of an offshoot of the Call of Cthulhu system. Moving towards sort of, I like these narrative games. I found in my experience more than the D20 add your modifier, sort of combat in a grid. I've been gravitating more towards the narrative sort of variable successes and degrees of success. That type of game, I think, is a little bit more, as I get older, that's the kind of stuff that I want out of a game.
Very cool. And I want to add one thing up off the bat, which is as Dan mentioned, we started with D&D. I think Advanced Dungeons and Dragons.
Advanced,
was
right at the tail end of the second edition.
Yes.
Yep.
No, Advanced was before. That was
It was before?
second edition.
I know we had the
Right?
books.
Yes.
Hayden had the books.
There's basic, advanced, and then second edition.
Yeah.
Well, you have
Okay.
you have to describe the cover of the book. That is what will date you.
Yeah, right. We were just talking about the Vracus, the
Githyanki.
Githyanki cover.
Githyanki on the cover of
Unearthed. No.
Fiendfolio.
Fiendfolio.
Folio.
Yeah.
But I did want to say I wanted to give a shout out to our friend Coops, who we did a lot of our early gaming with, and for quite a while following, who he's been listening to the podcast recently and been talking about it, and also who said the nicest thing anybody has said about the podcast, thing that meant the most to me, which was Hayden would have loved this podcast, and Hayden is his brother that helped to get us into this hobby that we lost just over 20 years ago. So not to get sentimental, but something he said that meant a lot to me. So shout out to Coops. I'm glad he's listening. And we all definitely, at least us here, owe a debt to Hayden for helping to get us into this world.
Very much so.
That was a pretty cool thing to hear. Anyway, I'll just lead with this to open up discussion is, what do you guys think about Dungeons and Dragons?
Wow.
And then I will move back from the microphone.
Step away.
I did want to say, I had envisioned this discussion mostly being fantasy, as in like swords and sorcery focused, but like not exclusive. So bring up, we've already mentioned other systems, bring them up as appropriate. But in general, I want that to kind of maybe be where we start, and then we can go from there. So,
Well, because vampires are real. They're not fantasy.
exactly.
Yeah.
I think on a baseline, if Dungeons and Dragons was never a thing, we would not be sitting around this table right now. Through all the additions and whatever qualms people have with the systems and the people who create them, without Dungeons and Dragons, I think the tabletop gaming industry would be very different than what it is today.
Come on, I know somebody's got some fucking hot takes on D&D.
You're absolutely right. I mean, it's hard to say what the world would be like without it because it spawned so much. It really gave a voice to sort of joint storytelling in a way. But I mean, its origins are as a board game, chainmail, and then turned into so much else. But I think if I were to, so I will just lay it all bare and say it is not my favorite system. I think it serves a purpose. I think it is a good entry into role-playing games in general, simply because there is so much content and there is, it is all delineated. It's hard to get lost. Well, no, it's easy to get lost, but it's hard to not have the answer to the question of what happens when this situation arises, which is kind of a strength, but it's also a weakness because there are some players and DMs that get locked into that mindset of this is how it is and there is no deviating from that. And you can get in some pretty great arguments that way. So I would say that it's spawned these other games which take a much different take on how to play a role-playing game. Devin, I'm interested in games more now as I grow older that are less rulesy and more allow the players to develop a plot jointly, as opposed to I am the dungeon master and this is the game I am providing for you to essentially react to. So in that case, Dungeons and Dragons is very linear in some cases, and it's also been hobbled together over 5 editions now. Like there are just some sacred calves that will never go, that have no business being there and don't make sense in context with each other. So if I had a problem with anything of D&D, it would be things like, why is magic missile an automatic hit spell, and and why does sleep just affect a certain number of monsters? And I don't think they get a saving throw. Weird things like that are first edition dynamics that have made their way through to 5th edition.
I think to your earlier point too is with D&D, the ubiquity of it, right? If you're going to start role playing it is so much easier to probably find people that play D&D than any other genre of the game of role playing, of tabletop. So I think it lends itself in that matter as the gateway drug, so to speak, into the rest of it, which is, I guess, one way to look at kind of being eternally grateful for it is it will probably be the primary recruitment tool for many years to come. Although, that being said, we certainly see so many more new systems being created now, but we're also in the thick of it. So we're more keenly aware of that.
Yeah, there's a lot of media around other games popping up. I mean, I remember Critical Role is the big one, but the Adventure Zone is another huge, has a huge following, and they got started doing a sort of comedy podcast. They started playing D&D. Their audience went with them, and then since then they've been branching out into other games. And whether the Adventure Zone is sort of your flavor of gaming, they are bringing their audience in further deeper into the gaming world and exposing them to these other cool systems like Monster of the Week or Fate Core or whatever other things they're playing nowadays. But I think, as more media is available around these other games, there may be, different entry points than, just D&D. I don't think it's going anywhere anytime soon, 5th edition, but
Honestly, I don't think we're there. I don't think we're at a point where people are getting into role-playing games not through D&D. I think D&D is so ubiquitous with the idea of a role-playing game. I mean, it wasn't until maybe 6 months ago that I explained to my wife that, we're not actually playing D&D. That, right? When I say I'm going to D&D, I'm not actually playing D&D. And she's like, well, what are you doing? And I'm like, well, we're playing this other game. It's like D&D. And she's like, there are there are other games. Yeah. I think it's been around for so long. It's become so much a part of the culture that it, like Dan said, it is a gateway. And I'd love to see a point where new people who don't necessarily know what a role-playing game is are introduced to a different game before D&D and don't have all of the sort of baggage, the training that comes from starting with D&D. I think that would be really great, but I am happy that it exists, and I mean, it's given us much joy over many years. I also think it's interesting that it's been around for so long. So many of the nerd culture sort of things have come from it, but it also, over the years, has done a really good job of borrowing from those things and making it a part of D&D. I mean, it's almost like the chicken and the egg question. What came first? D&D doing that or this movie doing it, and a lot of times it's a sort of back and forth, like a cultural back and forth where the lines are blurred and you're not sure, is this a D&D thing or is this from Game of Thrones? I don't even remember at this point.
Oh, I thought you were okay. I get you. I thought you were talking about the cringy Oriental Adventures expansion for D&D, which was directly people like ninjas. Let's make an expansion that does ninjas.
That's part of it, right?
Dan's going for the top shelf Oriental Adventures.
Oh, that's so sick that you got it.
That's certainly a big part of it. We see D&D will take whatever is popular at the time and make a source book about it, right? Why not? They're there to make money. Why not?
Pop culture becomes D&D. D&D becomes pop culture.
Yeah.
I'll add that I think, to Devin's point, I still think that it's D&D almost exclusively to the layman, but I think it's closer than it's ever been to other things having a baseline appeal beyond the deep dive, beyond just okay, it's D&D, and then if you go deeper in, you get some other things. I think Pathfinder is probably the closest thing that has come to having initial access points where you have, a couple of the Glass Cannon podcast network is one of the 3 biggest role-playing podcasts, and they play exclusively Pathfinder, Starfinder, whatever. What company is that? Paizo?
Paizo,
Yeah,
yes.
Paizo.
Exclusively Paizo products, and they have a shitload of shows, and that partnership has gone very well for them. And there's Pathfinder video games you were talking about. So I think that is the first thing that might be like the case of like, okay, there are different entry paths, maybe.
The thing with Pathfinder is that it's D&D, right? I mean, like let's be honest.
True.
It might be a better rule system. It might be a better rule system, but like it's doing all the same like
Scratching the same itch.
things, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we've got orcs, we've got tieflings, we've got
Characters
the
have a
evil
hit-
necromancer.
Yeah.
Like
Characters have hit points. Characters have armor class.
sure. And,
You
don't
know,
get me
you
started
roll
on hit
initiative.
points and armor class.
Well, let me take that sacred calf into my sights. But yeah, I mean that is exactly it. Like they are fundamentally, they share the same DNA.
Yeah.
I will say, just it kind of was a matter of scheduling. John isn't in on this one because of when we're doing this and where we were in the arc. But John is a recent and very devout convert towards Pathfinder as opposed to D&D. So he's, I'm sure, chomping at the bit listening to this. So we'll have to give Devin, because Devin is the one that introduced us to Pathfinder. Those of us that are here, besides Andrew.
Before you go on your rant, Devin, I just want to say I do think Pathfinder seems like a cool game. I have played the video games. It seems like a better version of D&D. Go.
Thank you, Jake. Glad you see things my way. Yeah, I think I agree with the sentiment that D&D and Pathfinder share the same DNA. They're doing the same thing. And Jake, we've actually talked about this, where those D20 games are great for simulating combat on a grid. And I think both those games, that is the 99% of what those rule systems are for, what the game is built to do. And that's great. And it's fun. But for other mediums and for other things you're trying to do, those games aren't necessarily the best choice. But Pathfinder, I think, has a robust rule system. All the times when someone is playing D&D 5th edition where they go, man, that's weird. Is there a rule for that? And you end up having to go to some message board or a Reddit post to get 5 people's interpretation on it. What Pathfinder does is they have all those systems. They've sort of thought about everything, and they're in the core rule book. They're easily accessible. You don't need any extra content. Everything is available
How many pages
online.
is the core rule book?
It's many.
It's about 600, right?
That was a leading question.
But like the rule book,
Wow, wee wah.
the core rule book has everything you need to play and run the game. Magical item crafting, all the spells, you have all your classes and archetypes.
It's Encyclopedia Britannica.
Right. But not every game includes those things. There are some systems that they want, it's either in another book, whether they intentionally made that so that they can sell you 2 books, or it's an oversight where, people are engaging with our game in this way. We need to make another piece of literature so that they have these things. But what Paizo does really well is they know how their game is played, and they have a pretty good idea of how people are going to use it and what they're going to want. And they just put those things in the book from the get-go. And anything else, anything that's new, they have been really good about doing erratas. When the 2nd edition came out, there was a sort of a few erratas that came out. They reprint the books, but you can go online and find these things easily accessible, or you can just ignore it. You can just play the game how it shipped with the book.
I just looked it up. 640 pages.
Yep.
Fun fact.
Yep.
If you combine the Dungeon Master's Guide and the Player's Handbook, D&D 5e, it is 639 pages.
I would say you don't really need the DM's Guide to
I'd
play.
say the DM's Guide is the most trash book that
Yeah.
D&D makes.
Except for
The magic weapons. Yeah. You need those tables.
The one thing I want to add on as a positive light on Pathfinder, encouragement
Pro
to
Pathfinder?
Pro Pathfinder. I played Pathfinder exactly one time.
Same for me
Yep.
and Matt.
Yes,
Yep.
that Devin ran a game that we plan on playing again. I never played it. I've never opened the Pathfinder core rule book. I used what do you call it? Character sheet building thing. What's it called?
It's called Path Builder. It's just a character building app. It's a web app that a fan created.
Right. Because of how they do that, and I don't want to get into OGL stuff, but because of that, I was able to input everything I wanted, pick my options right from there. And yeah, obviously I have a gaming background, so I can kind of figure it out. But the thing about having a system like that, where there is a answer for everything and there's a rule for everything, is that's probably, despite that sounding intimidating, that's probably an easier first time DM than a system which is dependent on the DM doing like, well, let's make a decision about what the best thing to happen here. I'm just gonna kind of make a decision based on what you're trying to do. There isn't really a rule for that. I think that is very hard for a first time if someone hasn't played a lot of role playing games, and
Improv.
I think having the structure is an easier bridge. And Pathfinder does that, I think, even more than D&D does. I think there are more rules in Pathfinder, but they do have good tools to find and use them.
How long has D&D 5th edition been out? I don't know.
10 years, almost.
What?
There are
crazy.
no rules.
Good God.
There are no rules for crafting magical items. No in-depth dive into crafting magical items. And that is so quintessential to like D&D role playing, where it's like you have a sick wizard. They have a class called an artificer, and there is no published rules on how to create magical items or how much they cost if you're going to the store. You know, a lot
Are you
of
sure about that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Nothing from Wizards of the Coast. There might be published things out there, but on the
No,
DM's Guild, Andrew,
I'm not going to take you up on that to say that there is, and I can't believe you didn't find it. What I'm going to say is,
don't tell me Xanathar's Guide to Everything, please.
no, not a bit. I am not an expert on the D&D system by any stretch. What I would say is, I don't know if it matters, because I think the idea of an economy in D&D is kind of absurd.
Sure. Yeah, I can agree.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I really enjoyed, I forget who ran it, when you had the counterfeit coin heist in the casino.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah.
Jake ran that one.
And as soon as you started things were popping off in my head. Like, yes, that has tuned into so many things I've thought about, like the idea of a gold economy you could just magically fabricate these coins. So the idea of a high level wizard crafting a magical item, it begs all these questions of who is it for, and why are they even doing it in the first place, other than I suppose they could, like, it's a story arc. And so the idea of a player doing it, I suppose you could come up with something, but it really, I don't know, it doesn't fit in the world. I can't even say that, because D&D, you're meant to create your own environment. I mean, there are published scenarios and campaign settings that sort of try and articulate, this is what the world is like here. And maybe in that world, wizards are a dime a dozen, and you can go to the magic store and get your magic item for 50 gold pieces. But in my view, it should just be that, the wizard will do this thing for you, but that's going to be a jumping off point for another quest. Mm-hmm. So the idea that there are rules that dictate, well, it's going to take you 1 week for every plus of the sword, and it's going to be 1,000 gold pieces for every plus of the sword. And yeah, sure, you could have it, but that just gets really rulesy.
I wonder if it would be interesting to have a sort of realistic high fantasy setting. I feel like it would look like Star Trek, right? Like Star Trek is this setting where no one wants for anything. It's like a capitalist utopia, right?
Yeah.
Like you can just go to a replicator and get whatever you want. There's no need for food. Like you don't have a job unless you want to pursue a thing, and I feel like the way that like a lot of the D&D or just high fantasy settings are, it's like, it would either be like that or it would be like just an apocalypse, right? It would be one extreme or the other, but I don't know if it would be fun to have a game set in that magic utopia.
Well, I have two questions that kind of segue off of this. One is, and we'll maybe get to this later, is about the scarcity of magic. I think I described once to the way of thinking of people who can use magic, effectively at a high level to create sort of a utopia, was like the professional athlete from your town. Like that's how often they occur. So that kind of puts some scope on it. But we can talk about that later. What I'm actually curious about that I want to ask all of you is what in your minds makes a good fantasy setting? And maybe a specific system that relates to that kind of thought process or idea for you.
One thing I just want to add, it kind of half-assed answers your question, but it's the thinking process through that, because I think it depends on what kind of fantasy game you want to play. And I think there are strengths to a lot of different systems depending on the kind of game you want to play and what is happening in that game. What is the crux of the thing that's going to happen at the table? The conflict. Is the conflict going to be investigation and discovery? Is the conflict going to be
mystery,
tactical combat? Is a conflict going to be like adventure and exploration? And I think there's different things. Is a conflict going to be internal and role playing and social? And I think those are all different things. But something that Jake and I think we've all said before, you kind of brought up now, and I think you mentioned it before we even started recording, is one of the biggest problems with fantasy, as Andrew said, is like it's hard for magic to not always be the thing.
The answer.
Yeah.
The answer to the problem is magic.
Right. Why doesn't this quest giver just help us?
Right. Or like, how do we do this thing? Well, their magic does everything.
All of it.
Right? Like magic is always...
You don't even have to get that high level before the spells start making it so that there's no such thing as a mundane challenge. You know, like if we have to travel really far, well, that's fine. I can turn into an eagle.
So I actually wanted to take this chance to ask Matt this, because so what I'm referencing, we've role played for a long time. The first game Matt played with us was a 4+ year campaign that we played in a homebrew world. Jake and I co-DM'd. We had 2 different parties. There's an overarching story. It kind of went back and forth. But it was a very low magic fantasy world deliberately. Like essentially magic didn't exist. Arcane magic didn't really exist at all. Monsters were extremely rare. It was a very gritty, relatively grounded world. And then we were kind of gradually reintroducing magic, was sort of part of the big arc. There was some divine magic. So Matt, your past experience before this was like watching Critical Role and having that kind of idea. How did you feel about coming into like having that sort of fantasy game of low magic, and then compare to what you've had exposure to by media and maybe some of the shit we've played since then?
Well, I think firstly, that campaign was in 3.5, so that was a whole other sort of beast compared to, I think when I first started watching Critical Role, I think they were just playing 5e. I don't even remember, because back then I didn't even know they were like different versions. I thought it was just, it's D&D. It's this thing that's existed for, 40 years at this point, and they're just making up a story, and there's a set of, you roll dice according to a book. I never even looked up the book until we sat down and played. And at first I was like, wow, this really isn't the thing that I thought it was going to be. But to me, and like, it wasn't so much about, at least for me, and again, maybe because it was 3.5, the rules didn't really matter so much to me. Like it did when it came to things like a grapple check. It was, fuck. How do you do a grapple check? Like,
grapple, that's exactly what I was thinking.
Yeah, exactly. So, but the games that we played back then, we would have entire like 4-hour sessions where we didn't roll dice. It was just role playing. So it's like, and for me, that's what Critical Role was. It wasn't even so much that it was they're playing D&D. It was like watching a live action play, like an improv play of this fantasy story where there's magic and there's swords and there's different things. And I enjoy the story element of it all. So what we play now and other things we played, everything's great. Like I don't see the problems that I think a lot of you all see, because you've been playing it for so long and you've had so much more experience and like reading the books, like I just like telling a story. Like I don't the dice and that kind of stuff, like they help tell the story because I also love chaos. Like I like when something fails and it's like, you know, it's part of, you don't always get a great clean ending to a story or nothing works out as the way it does.
Sometimes you get shot in the chest with a shotgun.
Yeah, you know.
Spoiler
And,
alert.
Matt never changed. That's beautiful. That's a beautiful way of looking at the game.
And also, like, at the same, when it comes to like, oh, magic can solve every problem, like, yes, but also no. I mean, that's, as the DM, like, that's my challenge in fun. Like, knowing that you guys can just turn into a fucking eagle and fly, like, cool, I had a bunch of stuff that was going to be on the ground. Like, now you have to land at some point. Like, you have to not be eagles at some point. Now you've wasted spells. Like, how can I slow this down? How can I make it so that you don't have all those spells anymore? What can I do to like penalize you for using magic when it's like, oh, we're in the shitty swamp. Like, we're just going to turn into eagles and fly. Okay, well, there's something on the ground chasing you and, you know, it's going to catch you when you land. And now you've kind of blown half your load. Like, now what? And
No one
like,
wants to blow half their load.
That's the fun in the storytelling for me is, as the DM, it's my job to make magic
Have a cost.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
That
That's
it can
smart.
solve some problems, but hey, guess what? I can ruin your day after you've, you know, gotten out of my shitty swamp.
Matt, talking about that load. Josh, I know you want to say something. I want to
About Matt's load?
well,
It's mighty hefty.
we talked a lot about it before we recorded. So I want to talk about first the 30-second adventuring day. You guys all familiar with this concept?
No.
Andrew, have you heard of this?
I have not.
This is this idea where a lot of games, let's say the DM wants to have a sort of, you know, where combat is rare and they want to do a lot of role playing and things like that. Or even it happens in dungeon crawlers. But the 30-second adventuring day is when the party wakes up from a long rest. They go in, they have one encounter where they just go Nova, use all of their abilities, and then without any constraints for time or anything like that, no danger, they're like, well, let's just put up a tiny hut and rest for another 8 hours and then, you know, get all our stuff back and go again. It is a common problem that people talk about, you know, hey, my group always wants to leave the dungeon and go to go do a long rest. How do I deal with that? And I feel like it's a common thing with D20 systems, whether it's Pathfinder or D&D. I don't know if I've ever encountered that sort of play style in a D6 pool system or like the Call of Cthulhu system. I don't know if it's just the people that maybe I'm playing those other games with have moved beyond that 30-second adventuring day, or if it's more innately tied to that D20 combat simulator game.
I think that's another one of those sacred cows Andrew was talking about, the like recharge on a long rest or, you know, at night or whatever. And it's been around in D&D since the beginning, I think.
Well, Wizards in the first, I think second edition, it wasn't even spell slots. It was you had to select the spells that you could have. And when you cast them, they were gone. So if you had, you know, the fireball spell memorized and you cast it, well, that's your fireball. You can't swap out another third level spell to use it. So to 5e's credit, they made it that it was spell slots of a certain level. If you had 2 third level spell slots, they could be 2 fireballs. But once they're gone, you have to do your long rest to get them back. So I think that's the corner they've painted themselves into. If there's a 6th edition of D&D, I feel like there's an opportunity for them to revisit that. But in a way, I don't think that they can, because there's such an old school fan base of Dungeons and Dragons that would go, no, this is how it is. How could you change that? You know, I don't want to learn something new. So I don't know. I've thought about this, like what they have talked about the next edition of D&D, and I also see it being like a split, you know, a schism, almost a religious schism, where they could have, you know, what they know to be a better system where they deal with these legacy issues, but they also sort of have a 5e plus system where it's like the faithful can have the D&D they've always known and loved, and it'll be a bit more open-ended and it won't have to deal with a lot of problematic content. But yeah,
Isn't
just
that
things
basically
like
how-
D&D Catholics versus D&D Protestants.
that's probably what it is. But yeah, I'm actually running. Sorry, I'll just say I am running a game right now where that has been an issue. They got Lehman's tiny hut, and they realized that the end of the arc was coming, and they constantly were on this point of, this could be the big bad. We need to be rested so we can do this fight. And so they were doing these long rests. But I did penalize them because there was a timeline. And the longer they took, the more advantages my big bad has at the end. And they kind of knew this. I don't think they ever got all the information that let them get to that point where they're like, oh, we can't do a long rest because he's just going to get more powerful. But eventually that did become evident. So I think that is the cure for the 30-second adventure day is you can certainly do your long rest, but there will be consequences.
Yeah,
That's,
that's what I meant. Like, as the DM, like, okay, that's what you're doing. Like, oh, well, that's fine. You can do that. I'm going to make consequences for you. Like, that's, and I might have to put more work in, but like, I mean, I'm telling a story I want to tell. And so, okay, like, let's figure out how to fix this now.
There are also other games out there that do a good job of baking that mechanic into the game, like Blades in the Dark or Scum and Villainy, like games with a clock.
Yeah.
Where, as time progresses, the enemy is doing a thing. So, and, or Dungeon World, right? Dungeon World has portents.
In fronts.
Yeah. So, if you're taking a long rest, the dragon is, recruiting allies while you do that.
You've even talked about this, or maybe it was Josh. I don't know which. You just in your DM playstyle is one of the ways to approach writing games and to simultaneously advance a plot and give your characters a lot of freedom. Have a series of events that happen with or without your characters. That those things are in motion. And then they'll affect, how the characters react to those things is what drives them. And it's kind of a... Yeah.
I mean, having both bad guys, NPCs, both antagonists and just non-player characters having their own agendas. So it doesn't work in like traditional dungeon crawl where the gelatinous cube waits in one room and the kobolds wait in the next room after that. And then there's a red salamander.
Yep.
But like, that doesn't happen as much anymore. Those kind of dungeon crawls, I think, are a little bit out of fashion. But basically, like, your bad guys want to do something and they're doing something. And if you're taking your time doing your thing, then they have more time to do their thing.
Josh, can I pick your brain about Delta Green real quick?
Sure.
So Josh and I have run this game called Delta Green. It is a offshoot. It uses the Call of Cthulhu system, but in just a modern setting. The premise is the group is a part of a government organization fighting back against the Cthulhian horrors and blah blah blah. But that game is very, very. The entire pace of the game, it's all dictated by what the characters do, and it's a narrative based game where combat is short. It really focuses on investigation and all the elements therein. At first, when I was started to run Delta Green, I was really looking at all the fine points of the published adventures that I was running. You have a little bit of a different experience because yours was homebrewed. But at the beginning, I was sort of looking at all these fine points and trying to sort of piece together the plot myself and then just hoping that the group went through it. But as I went on, I just started thinking more abstractly in what you just said about, what are the bad guys? What actually happened if there is a mystery? But what are the antagonists doing? And then what is the rest of the world? What is this sort of unsuspecting public? What are they doing? Who the people involved? What's their agenda? What do they want to get done? How will they do it? And I think once I started thinking that way, my prep was a lot shorter because I already knew what the bad guys were doing. And then it's just how does the group react to and interact with, those plans that are moving against them. I was wondering if you had sort of the same experience as we went through the arc of, just starting to think of what's going on in the context rather than what the group is actually doing.
Yeah, I think it's sort of how fantasy and otherwise, I think my game running style has shifted, is that I think I do a lot of prep up front because I try to build out either a world or a tiny section of it. And at least in my mind, it doesn't have to all be on paper, but a bit of it does. And then I need a pretty good idea of like what everybody is up to. And then increasingly that's just how I prep, is like the party does whatever they do. And then, it involves a little bit more improv because I have to think like, okay, well, I didn't prepare a bunch of scenes. Like maybe I prepared a scene or two, and then based off what they do, what else is happening? Like what did they uncover and what did they not uncover that's continuing to occur? And I think, that works in some fantasy, but also I think there is a place for the shit that D&D is really good at, or Pathfinder, because I think they can excel at the same thing. There are times when you want to have a fucking combat that is like not super long, but is like pretty dynamic, and you get to do different things and there's different challenges, or where, expending your resources and your powers becomes a bigger part of it. And in a game like I think it's harder to do in a game like a Monster of the Week or to some extent Delta Green, where it's like combat's kind of quick and brutal. There's just not many actions you can take. Sure. Mechanically, it's more narrative, and it doesn't scratch that same itch.
There's not a lot to zoom in on in those things, is it? Yeah.
Well, D&D is also a game, in a sense that like Delta Green is a system, and as you say, it is about telling a story. And the reason I say something like that is because if you get shot in Delta Green, the consequences are huge. Where I'm listening now with the Ithaca Project, Counselor Agent Audrey has just been shot and is walking around with a cane. You don't see that many canes in Dungeons and Dragons.
Just take a short rest,
magical,
man. Just take a short rest.
Magical.
Yeah, unless there's a sword in it or a magical orb at the end.
Exactly.
Cane of fireballs.
Literally an hour later, you could expend some hit dice and you've got your quote unquote hit points back. So, I mean, there are some rules in there about, damaging wounds, some consequences if you had to make a death save, their lingering wound effects, whatever, but nobody ever plays that. So, D&D is this game about combat where it is a puzzle system almost. Like you've got these monsters, maybe this one's immune to cold, so don't use my cold effects, I'll use fire and they're super vulnerable to that. That kind of puzzle system is kind of what they're working with. So as you say, that scratches a very different kind of itch. If you're looking for a grungy, gritty, low fantasy setting, I don't think it's Dungeons and Dragons, because unless you play with the hardcore rule where I think it's a long rest is a short rest. If you want to roll hit dice to recover, you have to do a long rest for that. There's no such thing as a short rest, which I think would be very challenging for a lot of standard D&D players. So long story short, it's kind of more of a game than a system.
That's a good way to put it.
So it's funny you say, I feel like D&D is trying to do two things at once, though. It's trying to be that combat simulator board game, but it's also trying to be a role-playing game, right? I mean, there's all this these source books with all this information about this world and these characters you can talk to or kill. But I think because it's trying to be both, it's not doing a great job at either. I actually, I don't think it's a great combat simulator because I'm a Warhammer player. And if you want to play a game where you're fighting monsters and stuff, then there are a lot of cool tabletop like mini games out there that do it way better because it's all they try to do. They don't try to make you make role-playing choices in the middle of combat. And one thing I've griped on with D&D a lot is that because it's a game, if you make a role-playing decision, your character's probably going to die. Like if you take a suboptimal build or a suboptimal weapon choice, you're fucked.
or you're not having as much fun as another player who did do the min-max. Like my pet peeve is the Warlock. Like why would you ever take anything but Eldritch Blast? It is your number one effect, unless you're going to do some crazy like hexblade thing or whatever. But otherwise, it's like they're not good fighters in hand-to-hand. They're not great spellcasters, but their one cantrip they can just fume away on is Eldritch Blast. So you are the Eldritch Blast machine.
But, Josh was saying how, there's different kinds of fantasy. And I think what this really boils down to is, and we talked about this in an email, Andrew, like when you sit down for your session 0, don't sit down and say, hey guys, we're going to play D&D. Sit down and say, hey, I want to run a fantasy game. What do we want it to be like? And if your players are like, I want it to be like Lord of the Rings. Like magic is really rare. There's a few wizards, but they're super powerful. And like, it's kind of gritty but also heroic. And then you go like, well, that doesn't really sound like D&D. That maybe sounds more like Dungeon World or I don't know what I'm not the person to ask because
the One Ring role playing game
or the One Ring. Maybe, I don't know. Is it good?
The new edition is very good.
But pick the game that's right for the story you want.
Oh, and you're absolutely right. I think you're relying on the idea that first of all, it's not a new group because if you say let's I've heard about D&D, I've seen Critical Role, I want to do that. You kind of are channeled into D&D, and there's an easy way to get channeled, and you will have that experience. And maybe after a year of playing, you'll be like, you know what, this is kind of feeling pretty crunchy, or you're having a great time, But I just feel like with that game, there's at 10th level, you would expect that you are a more competent character, but your antagonists also scale at the same rate you do, so the challenge is kind of equalized. And the other pet peeve I have about D&D is armor class. Like it doesn't scale in the same way. So at some point, there's actually no point to wear plate mail because you just get slow and stings. Well, this character's got a +9 to hit. Oh, look, I hit your 18 armor class, So again, it is kind of a game in that sense. Whereas, in a real gritty system, if you've got plate mail, you're invulnerable to a lot of different types of damage. That is not really modeled well with D&D. But to follow on your point, though, about selecting the system, that kind of requires an experience with different systems and knowing that there are options out there.
Right.
But absolutely important to say, what kind of game are we going to play? Because if it is, we want to just have a light and fluffy kind of swords and sorcery kind of thing, D&D is probably perfect for that because it's pretty rare you're going to lose your character. Like you have to have a lot of bad rolling for that to happen. Whereas other systems, it's baked in. You could lose your character and it could be really epic when it happens. But
I think what's kind of interesting, I'm sitting here trying to think of high fantasy settings that have either been written about or played. I mean, Forgotten Realms comes to mind, but a lot of them have that same feel as Lord of the Rings.
Well, yeah, that's where they're getting their inspiration.
Right.
Yeah.
But it also makes it very obvious that the issue of prolific magic and what the repercussions of that aren't addressed very often. And so I think that's the same reason why we're thinking about it right now, trying to come up with the answer of why magic isn't the answer to everything.
Yeah, I mean, Andrew brought up in an email in preface to this conversation, like in that world, why do castles have walls if people have,
Wall of Force
and stone to mud and whatever? Why use all those resources? Well, unless maybe it's, you can make a castle with like 2 9th level spells and boom, boom, boom.
The castles are cool is the answer for why you have castles.
I think that's a lot of these problems, a lot of the solutions, that we've been talking about. It all comes down to one thing, and it's the GM doing some extra work, whether it's mental or hitting the books or whatever. I actually wanted to shout out Matt. He's been running us, or we did a couple sessions of a D&D game, and there's this mystery that we have not yet gotten to the bottom of, and we have the backing of a very powerful organization, and we have all this magic and all this stuff, and none of it has borne fruit. But what we have had to do is, go down to the gutters and talk with some of the people on the lowest level where, we're high level characters and we're powerful and we have this magic. But those things haven't been able to identify the problem or solve the problem. And so we're actually having to interact with the world in order to do it. Matt, you said your experience is limited, but, I played a lot of D&D games where, if we used magic, the GM would get frustrated or try and sort of push us one way or another. But, you can tell that Matt's done work to sort of think about this world as a real place where magic exists, but it is not the answer. And I think it's just the GM doing that extra work to make it so.
Yeah. I mean, to me, that's the fun. Like I said, that's the fun of it is there's all these rules. And, I think in that email you'd mentioned 421 plus spells and counting, like, sure, maybe I can try to think about, 40, 50 of them that'll help get you out of a situation. And like, okay, well, what can I do to make it so that those things aren't helpful? But it's also, again, I think it's because I don't have as much experience with it as you guys. You know what I mean? Like it's more fun for me to come up with a way around it than just sort of go, well, it exists. So what's the, I don't know if I'm saying it right. You know what I mean?
There's nothing stopping you as the DM from saying, that's a great idea you had. It doesn't work in this case.
Yeah.
Because like there are so many typical plot resolutions, like, you've got to find this guy who's going to tell the players the next plot nugget. He's going to give them that piece of information. And just as he's saying I can't tell you, he's going to kill me. And then they says, well, the guy you're looking for is, and then an arrow erupts from his heart, right? It's like, oh, cure light wounds, it's.
So, Andrew, I think we all definitely agree with that, but I will say the internet disagrees with you. Because
the internet always disagrees.
Within the last couple of years, jumped on a few like D&D forums and like Facebook groups, and I was shocked. I was shooken at how the vast majority of people look at the rules as unbending, like, no, like if you do that, you're a shitty game master.
I made one comment one time, and I was amazed at quickly.
And you threw your computer away.
Yeah, I was like, no good is going to come of this, so I'm just going to walk away slowly.
Yep. That's
it's
something
raw, right? Rules is written.
Yep, rules is written and rules as intended.
We started a role-playing podcast, and as I mentioned before, we were relatively insular in how we role-played. We had a group that, every once in a while, somebody new would come in. Ryan joined us. Then, a few years later, Matt joined us. But in general, we had our own experience, and we developed kind of together a style we like to play.
A language.
Yeah, the language of how we game. And what the system, it didn't always matter that much because, first of all, we didn't have that much exposure. We didn't know that many different systems. So we just kind of modified it to make the games work how we wanted to. And one of the biggest eye-openers for me of just being more exposed to it on scale is that most of the biggest, I would say all of the biggest role-playing podcasts or media things are very fucking down with running it by the rules. Like that is what they do, and that's what people expect, and that's what, very well-produced things that I enjoy listening to, but like there's times I'm like, man, they're having these rules conversation for fucking minutes and minutes. Yeah. And the combat's taking 2 fucking episodes. And I'm like, and yet, hey man, they have hundreds of thousands of listeners. So, it's people like it, obviously. But yeah, it is weird.
Well,
to me.
Critical Role has a big stake in it, right? Because they're kind of at the teat of Wizards of the Coast to make sure that they are authentic. Like, I don't think that they can really paint outside the lines too much. And certainly, Matt Mercer's been doing this for a long time, and I think he's got a brand of his own to maintain. So I don't think he's gonna deviate too far from the party line. The other podcast you referenced that does Pathfinder similarly probably has in agreement with Paizo. It's like we're going to play our game, but we're also going to play it faithfully to the rules. I don't know if there are bigger conversations, like if they get after action sessions where somebody from Paizo says, you made a call on one of those rules, and it wasn't. Page 47 says, you didn't do that right. So I don't know. My thing with being a DM has always been about pushing the story. So if it means making an executive decision in the moment that this is how it's going to play out, as opposed to the rule says this, I am so more interested in just pushing it and saying, this is what happens. And I think it's reasonable. I mean, maybe the rules disagree with me, but it avoids me taking 10 minutes out of our session to look up a rule and, get that
It's
resolution.
also more interesting, right?
Amen. Yeah.
I think as the DM, it's your story, it's your world. You're the god. Like, there's a book that says this. Like, that doesn't happen in my world. Sorry, it's homebrew. Okay, it's a homebrew story. Like, that's a guideline and that's a reference sheet, but that's not how everything works.
Well, and I think the terminology, sorry to step on you, I think the terminology of the dungeon master is very, is very telling in the D&D system, because it implies that it is your game. But I've always thought that I am one part of it. I've got the world that I'm presenting, but the game doesn't happen with just me. It's because there's an active audience of players who are contributing and throwing out different ideas. And I know the last time we did one of these roundtables, you suggested that, you may have an idea as the game master or the storyteller that this is how it's going to go. And then a player goes and says, I wonder if this is going to be like this. And you're like, oh, that's such a better idea than I had. So, maybe I will just take that and, you were so prescient, you figured it out.
I mean, right off of that, though, I think that's the connection, right, between a game master and their players is a certain level of trust and expectation, right? And that comes from session 0, that comes from experience of playing together, all the things that we've talked about, that when you're performing actions in the game and you're moving the plot along, you're trying, generally everyone's trying to do it for the greater good of the game. And when that happens, when you have a group of people who are like-minded, generally it's 9 times out of 10 it's going to go maybe not the way you wanted the story to go specifically, like a happy ending, but it's going to be interesting, it's going to be dynamic, and it's going to be fun.
Yeah, and I'll say, as someone who I would say I tend towards being a curmudgeon and
You
a
don't
contrarian.
No, come on.
And just very habitual. We played 3.5
Relentlessly.
for years after we didn't even really like it. We just knew it, and then we had all the books, and very slow to adapt to new things. I will say, I think as far as D&D, I think 5e is by far the best D&D system in my mind personally, because of how many rules it's scaled back on. Not saying it's perfect, but for the things that I think are good, and this kind of goes a little bit against what you said, Jake, is that it's trying to do different things and it doesn't do any of it really well. I'm not saying you're wrong, because I get that perspective. It's not as good of a combat simulator as like a Warhammer, a tabletop thing, but I think it's a pretty good compromise, because I think there's enough. I like the grays. I like, when we talked about Pathfinder versus D&D, I like that in 5e, there's a lot of times where the DM just kind of has to make a call on, okay, you're trying to do what? And like Matt says, the Dungeon Master says this, and as long as you kind of have it in mind of, we're telling this collaborative story, but I'm going to make a ruling that it works this way. I think D&D 5e is a good balance of, there's a structure in place that a new person can learn, but still enough that you can move along without knowing a million rules. I think it's pretty decent at that.
I would love for any of these big, let's say Matt Mercer, and he's actually done videos for GMing. He's talked about a lot of these things where it's like, there are times when my players will do something and I just make it up. Like, if you're ever stuck, just take a minute, throw a little combat at them and just make it up. And I think D&D, that's the sort of what you're talking about, is there are things like advantage and disadvantage that give the GM or the DM the tools to say, oh, okay, that's a lot of cool things that you're doing. I'm just going to give him disadvantage on his next attack, on the orc's next spear, whatever. And that I think that happens more than people realize, is that their GMs that they're listening to on their favorite podcast or watching on their favorite YouTube, series, they make a lot of stuff up. And I don't know that a lot of people understand that, because, they'll watch they have their brand of D&D that they like to watch and consume. And then they'll go and play with, a GM who's newer, who may not be confident in making those calls like you were talking about, where, they might feel compelled to go to the book. And if it doesn't, play out at the table the way that that player thought, then they think, well, this isn't D&D, or this is D&D that's not as good, or, and that's the sort of, I think it's bad for the hobby, because you have these really high expectations that are sort of sometimes not founded, where it's like, oh, you mean the GM doesn't have all of these things planned out and can't improvise, a guard standing at the front of the town or whatever.
In my opinion, most role-playing games are at their best when you are in uncharted territory, when the game has gone away, where you as a dungeon master didn't expect it, and everyone is sort of improving. I think those are the best moments. They're my favorite moments.
Well, that means that when it goes away from what the GM planned, it means the players are improving. It means the players are contributing. Like Andrew said, the players contributing collaboratively to telling the story.
Well, that brings up, to me, in my mind, a different fantasy system that we haven't talked much about, which is Dungeon World. And one of the things that makes that really compelling to the story and pushing kind of unforeseen circumstances is the mixed success, which is, it deviates a lot from, the D20, the pass-fail kind of thing. And having mixed results on your actions as you try to accomplish your goals has, I think in our experience, created some really cool moments, some kind of unexpected results. And
drama,
it branches your story in a very organic way, because it's based off of them trying to achieve the path they set forward to. So you kind of have this premeditated idea, and then it just permeates.
And for those who aren't familiar, Dungeon World is basically Monster of the Week, but in a high fantasy setting.
Yep.
If you listen to the podcast, the second arc, Into the Storm, was Dungeon World.
Yep. We've never played a long campaign of it. That's the only thing we've questioned, is how well it would stack in building a heroic character over time.
But there's also this idea in Powered by the Apocalypse games like Dungeon World and Monster of the Week of giving the players more freedom to improv, and in not only in what their characters are doing, but in world building.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really cool concept. And you do have to trust your players. You have to have a mature group of people who trust each other well enough to see where the story goes. I mean, if you can't have a bunch of like kids who are like, well, my character's Dragonlands, and then he goes on it and flies into space. Like, no, come on. But that idea of collaborative storytelling is
well,
cool.
That comes back to the caliber of the players too, right? Like you have a group which plays well together. You kind of know each other's beats and rhythms. Like in the Ithaca Project, no one started out by saying, you know what? I think my character is going to try and burn down Cornell. That would have made for an interesting little curveball, but I think you would have, as the storyteller said, you really want to do that?
Yeah, some people, I've kind of listened to different podcasts. Some people really take it upon themselves to just try to fuck everything up. Like that's their goal, is to really kind of break everything.
Yep.
Which is kind of sucks in my mind. But
I've heard pretty professionally done podcasts where there's a player who does that.
Yep.
And I've always thought to myself, I would stop the recording and I would say, hey, what are you doing? No, I honestly, like, hey, this isn't the story we want to tell.
Right,
and it's kind of gets back to that session zero of like, it goes both ways, right? Like the game master needs to be like, here's the kind of story that I want to tell. If you guys want to tell it with me, And if the players want to go another direction, that's the time to discuss it, right? If they're like, well, I was thinking about burning down the university. Well, here's why I'm not a fan of that idea. Or, you know,
You get picked up pretty quick for your arson attempts. Well, to pick up on Dan's point, the idea of character progression is also a very gamey mechanic that is super popular with Dungeons and Dragons. The idea of advancing a character level. And I don't know if there are many other systems that we've referenced that actually do that. I mean, most of them deal with sort of an incremental thing. You have experience points. Maybe you pump a stat here, an ability goes up there. But with D&D, there's this whole thing of graduating from level 2 to level 3, and now your spellcaster gets a new spell, your fighter gets a new ability, and it's to the point where most players don't actually want to start at level 1 because all the cool stuff is 5 years away. So, and I don't know. It's one thing a pet peeve I have about D&D is this idea that your characters only become interesting later. And you can't live in the now or have an interesting character now.
There's also game balance can actually kind of be boring. The idea of like everyone in the party has to be like equally skilled. I kind of find it boring. Like, look at like Lord of the Rings. I mean, Gandalf is a level 18 wizard and the rest of the hobbits are level 1 commoners. Like, and it's a super awesome story. Like,
Sure.
And the hobbits are still cool characters, you know?
Heroic.
Yeah. I like it sometimes when everyone isn't necessarily even, but again, you have to have the right group of players to do that, right? That's a really tough one.
Yeah.
Well, Dan, you brought up Dungeon World, and I wanted to give a chance to bring up other systems. So, I know we've focused a lot of the conversation on D&D-like things. Are there specific systems that anybody wants to highlight for things that they do well, for things that they bring in that maybe you've played or are interested in playing that you've heard of? Especially, Andrew and Devin that we haven't played with as much. Anything you guys want to mention?
I have one that I've always wanted to play. Dan is picking up the book right now.
So he went from like 600 pages in his Pathfinder to like 1,000 in whatever this one is.
But it's very small.
The Burning Wheel.
It is smaller.
Andrew, has anyone heard of this game, The Burning Wheel?
No.
So we were just talking about Dungeon World. Adam Coble, one of the designers of Dungeon World, this is his favorite role-playing game. This is the one that he was sort of drew inspiration from when he was talking about Dungeon World. The game there is so many rules, there are so many skills, but the basis of the game is you are testing your skills and abilities while playing to your character's goals, drives, beliefs, things like that. And actually, the character advancement is based on these things called Artha points, which is just maybe cool things that you do. Sort of, we think of like inspiration in D&D. There are persona points, which are when you play in accordance with your beliefs, or not necessarily, an action, but there could be a cool moment of role play that highlights maybe the insecurity of the confident wizard as he in confidence speaks with his companion about his fears for the upcoming mission. Could be awarded a persona point. And then there are things called deed points, which when you're a paladin who is on their quest to recover the grail and they smite the evildoer who holds it and then brings it back, you get a deed point. And these are all things that is how a character advances. That's how they level up. So it's not just kill enough monsters. It's, are you doing things that are important to your character, that develop your character's beliefs, their drives? You got Josh, you incorporated this into your one shot at the monster, where you have your merits, your drives, your bonds, and giving character points and things like that. The same thing is the basic advancement system in Burning Wheel.
I think they hired the same artist as the first edition D&D.
Maybe it's that class. The book is beautiful. It's that classic, black and white cartoon art. But it's a D6 pool system. You can bargain with the GM to use multiple skills. Say, I'm fighting against goblins. Well, I'm going to use my Goblin Wise skill, and I'm going to use my sword skill. So you get a little bit of a bonus thing.
Classic Goblin Wise.
Classic Goblin, who don't leave home without Goblin Wise. But it's stuff like that. And it's, again, it's a more narrative game. But you can zoom in on certain things. There are rules for complex moment by moment combat. There are rules for complex, like debates, rather than having an argument at the table. You have your little, you have your little sheet, and you roll against each other, body of argument, retort, rebuttal, dismissal, things like that. It's really, really fun. There's a lot to it. That's one I've always wanted to play.
Does it play like story-wise, or does it play more gritty?
Narrative, very, very, very narrative. They actually have another game. The same publisher came out with a game called Torchbearer, second edition, and that is more of the gritty survival, dungeon crawling adventure. But it's the same thing. It's D6 pool, test your skill, do the combat, move on.
I would like to read that, actually. It sounds really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
I am probably not going to give a great answer to this other than to say I think one of the best systems for storytelling has been the World of Darkness games, Vampire and the rest. Only because and it's funny, I as soon as you started talking about Burning Wheel, it says there's a lot of rules, a lot of skills, and my first thought was, it's almost the wrong direction I want to go with. But then I realized, Vampire has 30 abilities and 9 attributes. It's not a light system either. But the elegance of it is the idea of combining the attributes with the abilities, so that you gain these really interesting situational skill pools, that you can do anything with. But to that end, I'll say that a game I've just started running is a stripped down version of the World of Darkness system, where there's like 6 abilities and 15 skills. But the rules I gave myself as a storyteller in that one were: nobody makes a perception roll. It's literally based on whether your character has a high intelligence or not. So I wanted to avoid that scenario of there's something cool in this room. They may or may not see it based on their perception, but a failed die roll stops the story from progressing.
Yeah.
We gripe about that all the time.
Yeah, we talk about that a lot. Don't hide things you want the stories to know, or players
exactly.
to know. Yeah.
And by the same token, it was also the players only make a roll if there's a stress element to it. Otherwise, it is solely based on the pips they have and the abilities. So if they are experts at something, they just do it. And you can, if they want to make it stressful, if it's like, well, we need to get this done real quick. Well, okay, well, now you're making a roll because something interesting could happen. And that idea of the mixed success comes through in this system because the number of successes you need can be variable. So you can say an absolute success will take 5 successes. You only get 3. So you got to roll again, and maybe you don't get them. Maybe you botch now. It started out good, but then it went bad. So I guess I've always been carrying a torch for that system if I'm gonna choose one. But the rest is situational. It's always about the session 0. What kind of game do we want to play? And knowing you have access to those systems makes it, possible.
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of the World of Darkness systems too. Also, when it does come to combat, it tends to be faster. There's not as many dice rolls involved, which just makes combat interesting to me because it moves quickly. But there's still a lot of different types of things you can do, especially if you're playing a vampire. But I've played some World of Darkness Dark Ages games where you can take that and you could play in a D&D type like fantasy setting with the World of Darkness Dark Ages rules. And man, that would be great. Like you could make a gritty, dark fantasy world with magic, and that's just awesome. I did do that once actually with a group. And the funny thing is none of them had played the game. But like I said, do you want to get together and say, yeah, let's play D&D. And that was at a moment where I was really hating on D&D. So it's like, yeah, let's do that. And then they showed up and it's like, so here are your sheets. Here's how we'll do it. And it's like, oh, this is D&D, right? Yeah, this is totally D&D. And just scratched it out and wrote D&D.
But I mean, none of them were, a lot of them were actors. So they had that beauty of just wanting to give something to the story, right? Yeah. And be present in it. And so it didn't, the rules system, it didn't matter. It was all about, this is the story we're going to tell. I mean, not totally perfect because, of course, as you say, combat can be really, really brutal. So when one of them took 7 levels of damage, it's like, oh, your character's incapacitated. Okay, well, I guess there will be no long rest for this one,
Yeah. Another system that I have wanted to try, and kind of like a group of systems, is there's this game called Through the Breach, and it's based on the old, like, if you remember the Deadlands game, it uses cards instead of dice.
Yes.
And what is so cool about that from like a nerdy gamer perspective is you have a deck of cards. You have a certain amount of successes and failures in there, right? Like, it's not random. Like, it is random, but you're going to get the same good things and the same amount of bad things. You're just going to get them at different times because you're using a deck of cards. Like,
So
and
you
know how
shuffle the
people
deck?
say you have like your own deck, and
Right.
you draw a card and add like an attribute to it, but you've got 4 2s in there and you've got 4 aces in there. So, you're going to get, like, when people roll their D20 and they're like, it's all out of 20s. Like, no, that's not really how the dice work, but that is how a deck of cards work. So I kind of like that idea of, like, almost like you have this pool of how much stuff is going to be successful and how much is going to fail. And everyone kind of has the same tool. And those games usually have a cheating mechanic where you have a hand of cards and you can cheat them in to change things when you want to affect the action or the drama. So if you have a low card, you might cheat it in on the game master's like attack flip with an NPC to make that guy miss, or if you have a high card, you might cheat it in on your own thing, So I like those idea of alternate, like, non-dice mechanics, and that Through the Breach game is one I've always wanted to try.
There's a game that I never played, but I remember from way back called Amber, the Amber Diceless role-playing system. And it was so far back, I can't remember how it worked, but it's all in the name, right? It was all about, there's no dice in this. So I think it was all about just your character's attributes determined just how good they were. And when they came into conflict with somebody else, if you met with them, I don't know, maybe it was rock, paper, scissors, maybe that's how you decided it. But what I think would have been interesting about that is just, again, there's no dice involved. It's just about what do we need to do to propel the story.
Failing forward too. A couple of these games we were talking about have these fail forward mechanics. Dungeon World, Burning Wheel has it. Delta Green, absolutely. World of Darkness systems. I think, we game in sort of for an audience, and I think failing forward is great because you make the roll and the action doesn't stop. Something else happens. A new danger arises. Something else that you didn't see before is now in play. I think whether you're playing with friends at a table or for an audience, I think it adds drama. Unexpected drama, both for the GM and the players. And I think that's super important.
Yeah, games like Monster of the Week really rely on that to push the narrative forward. Like if you have an encounter where the players ace every roll, then it's boring.
Yeah.
Yep.
Something I've become more a fan of. It is kind of the same thing, the failing forward, but even in a game where it's a success or fail, a D&D, there's a difficulty. If you meet it, you succeed. If you don't, you fail. Having some kind of mechanic that the player can in some way choose moments that I'm going to do something to make it more successful. And to its credit, 5e does have inspiration built in. But the way they do it, it's very hard. You either have one or you don't. It gives you advantage on one roll. So we've tended to homebrew more is upping that inspiration pool. And I remember we started... and we kind of used it in the first arc we ever did, One Shot of Monster. And then when we started recording Curse of Strahd, having more inspiration points, having them be easier for the players to get so that they can choose a moment that, like, no, this not just is important for the game, but maybe it's important for my character, to have a resource to make that more likely to succeed. And you can look at it and be like, well, then that's making the game easier than it's supposed to. No, the DM can always make it harder. You can always just add more challenges, but still give you the resources to pick the times when you want to fucking bust your nut to do really well. One thing that we did in One Shot of the Monster that I look back on, I'm like, I kind of threw that at the end and it didn't go exactly how I planned, but I like the idea of it, is something that happened. It was I think it was from your little Epic Vision Quest, that the players did. Everyone got, okay, for the rest of the arc, one time before you roll, you can choose to have a critical success on an attack or any one roll for the rest of the arc. And I was like, afterwards, I was like, it didn't really like actually happen in the game how I wanted. I don't know if I pitched it the right way, but I really like that idea of like, okay, hey man, rest of the story, you can pick one moment for your character to shine in that moment. And I wish, it was like how Jake was talking about with the cards, having that way to be like, this is the moment, not just I want to win, I want to do better, but like, this is the moment for this character to be a big part of this story.
I think that's where I think a player envisions their character. And when there's a situation where it's like, this is, my character digs deep. This is when my character, digs into that well and does something heroic, right? Because, D&D or whatever game, if you're playing that heroic fantasy game, you want to have that heroic fantasy moment. And I think sometimes leaving it up to chance is tough. Sometimes it works out and it's awesome. There are some times where it doesn't work out and it kind of feels bad. But being able to say, hey, this is the moment my character is going to, throw themselves into the belly of the beast and do this, Herculean thing, even just for a moment. That's something that, lets a player play out what they believe their character is like. It's very empowering for players to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I like when I fail sometimes. I think one of my favorite memories of playing in those earlier 3.5 games with you guys was, I think it was a side quest, and I had some character. We went and infiltrated some guild of something, and we'd stolen something, and we were getting out, and we had to climb over a wall, and like I failed like 3 climb checks, and I died on the other side of the wall as everybody got behind. But I still remember that. I'm like, that shit was fucking cool. Like, yeah, I died and that sucked, but like I failed through. Like my character wasn't meant to get over that wall. Like that's part of the story. He was supposed to die there, and like that's it. I'm cool with it.
You were chronically bad with heights.
Here's the real question then. Would you, if we just took away the dice rolling mechanics in any game we're playing and relied solely on the players as sort of joint storytellers? So in that case, Matt, if you were there, having this side quest and I'm going to climb over this wall, and you decided, you know what, it'd be actually kind of epic if, at the very top, he lost his footing and he fell over and died. Obviously, because I got a busy week for the next, couple of weeks.
Yeah, I can't play on Monday.
I'm Etsy now, but I just think that would be an interesting evolution, because we look at these as games right now. We've got all these randomizers of dice and cards and such, and they do allow us, as Devin said, to rightly or wrongly, for the good or for the bad, adjust the flow of the story to make a more chaotic, more interesting story. But if you took that away and gave it solely to the players and the storyteller to jointly tell this story and maybe take some real hard knocks at the characters, like I think that is the the actualization of this game, right? Or the games that you play, is to get to a point where I am not so shallow as I need to win. I need to win every die roll I throw. What is interesting right now in this moment?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that gets into sort of, the inner workings of people. Is I think a lot of people play a lot of these fantasy games to escape the mundane, boring, like I'm never going to, dive in front of a car and save somebody from getting hit by a car. Like I feel like given the opportunity, more people are going to try to always succeed at the thing, because like that's the cool thing to do. Like, no, I want to climb up over the wall at the last second. And I think adding like the chaos random of a dice roll in that, no, there is a chance of failure at this, like that makes it fun, is picking up that dice and feeling it rattle around on your hand and it hitting the table and it's a 20 and then rolls over to a 2. Is that like, oh fuck, like, okay.
I think there's a very Buddhist concept where if you can imagine like a perfect life for yourself, right? You just keep imagining it and you have all these versions of a perfect life, but eventually it gets boring. And eventually you want something different. And I think that's kind of like, as you kind of describe this pinnacle of role playing, is that eventually you want something different than the perfect story, something that's more compelling, something more interesting.
That's when you start playing the weird, dark anti-hero characters.
Yeah, 100%.
I think it's easier for players to imagine their characters succeeding or predict what happens when they succeed, because you see a challenge and it's like, well, if I succeed, then I know what's going to happen. But what is sort of scary and dramatic is the unknown of failure. Like Matt, when he was sitting at the table trying to climb over that wall, he knew that if he succeeded, he would get up over the wall and escape. But he did not know what would happen to him if he was not able to get over that wall. And I think, it's to any average person or player, if we're going to, talking about games, the unknown of failure, it can be scary and stressful, but it can also be dramatic. So that's where I think, there is a benefit to having, the dice, because they make that choice for us. The dice choose the outcome, and so it's awesome and epic when when we succeed and it goes the way we want. But it can also be dramatic and terrible and scary and sad when we fail.
Well, if you notice my face, it's a little beat up. It's because Saturday night I was coming back from a ball with my girlfriend, and we were both very drunk. And I was helping her get up the stairs, and then I thought it would be a more interesting choice for me to fall down the stairs and knock myself unconscious.
Yeah,
Unconscious?
Unconscious.
Oh,
Wow.
Because I thought narrativly that was the more interesting choice.
There's a Buddhist concept about getting yourself punched out at a ball too, I think.
So what you mentioned, Andrew, it's that, because I remember having a conversation with John a while ago talking about, game systems in general and the push towards rules, light systems and whatever, less rules and moving in that direction. There's a point where it becomes not a game and it becomes improving a story. And not that that's a bad thing, but that's a different thing.
It's different. Yeah.
That's a different thing. So usually, I think my preference is telling a story, but having a factor, a third-party thing helping
Framework.
to decide how some of that story goes. Versus, hey, man, it can be really fun. Be in a long car ride with your friends and sort of do like a collaborative improv story, whatever.
Microscope does that really well.
Yeah.
There's a game called Microscope. Yeah. You make this timeline. You have like eras and scenes, and you can sort of zoom in to be like, let's take a look at that.
Yep. And that's, Andrew, you play with a lot of people who have that theater, have the improv background. And I think that's the hardest thing for what the average person stepping into the hobby is going well outside that framework.
Here's what we do. We play a D&D game. Everyone gets a Dungeon Master screen, and no one can check anyone else's dice.
That's
So
great.
here's a cheesy answer for the system I want to play. I want to play the one that we haven't created yet.
Oh, nice.
Because we've talked
Yeah.
about this, and we've come up with some pretty interesting and compelling kind of subclasses of rules. One rule system that I absolutely love, and amazingly we didn't write down anywhere apparently, which is really hard to believe. But when we were introducing Magic back into this 3-year campaign we had, Magic corrupted those that used it. And there was an actual corruption mechanic every time you used Magic. So it kind of put a ceiling on how far and how powerful you could become with Magic, which in a fantasy setting, I think is really, really cool, because it adds a real element of danger and cost to using Magic as the answer.
Well, I was just going to say, like, I think, me, and I've noticed in a lot of our games and even a lot of like podcasts I listen to is, Magic is just, I cast this spell. There are very few that are like, okay, you need the actual material components. Like, do you have these things? Like, it takes, ash and a feather and a glass ball. Like, nobody does that because it's kind of a pain in the ass, but that is a limiting factor to Magic is like, I want to cast Fireball. I don't have any more of this stuff to
I
cast
think
Fireball
the problem
anymore.
is, though, is it going to be an interesting story if we have to
that's
follow
just
the
it.
wizard around while he collects feathers and bat guano?
Well, so I think that's that's whether or not you're, playing the game of D&D or like what we do is to tell a story through, using this system to tell the story is we've taken, I think, kind of we've taken what's the difference between a game and a system, and we're trying to use the game to tell a story, but only the system of it. You know what I mean? Like, we want to tell a story in D&D, but we don't really want to use all of the game mechanics of D&D. I don't want to follow the fucking wizard around so he can pick lamb's wool. Like, that's not a fun story, but that's part of the game. Like, if I'm playing a video game...
5e changed it so you don't need to have components all the time.
Yeah, as long as you have a
arcane
focus.
Spell focus. Yeah, it's very fair.
But is that so in D&D, your typical D&D game, to answer Jake, no, that's not interesting. But if you're playing, let's say we don't know what the rule system is, but you're playing a fantasy game and there's this fucking ice demon and you have a wizard who needs to cast this kind of fire ritual. But to do that, it involves finding the heart of a salamander, and then it's like a one-time thing. Like, okay, that is interesting now, all of a sudden.
Sure.
But that's not D&D.
Yeah.
That's a different...
100% D&D plot you just gave us.
Well,
talking about. Well, okay, sure.
Andrew was talking about that before with like the magical items, where it's not this mundane thing. It's there's a reason you need this fire ritual, and it becomes this quest to find it and create what you need to do.
Not a lot of fantasy games that have a magic element that is not set spell list. I'm sure they're out there. I don't have any personal experience with them where it's an idea of like, I want to use magic. Monster of the Week has something like that.
Yeah,
you have a fucking use magic thing. So you can say like, okay, this is a ritual and this is what it takes to do it. And so I guess that is the answer to what I was just talking about. So yes, it's a D&D kind of plot, Jake, but like to make that in a game where it's not casting fireball, it's doing this ritual. Okay, well, there's your answer. If that's the game we want to play, maybe a dungeon world or that kind of thing is a better fit for it.
Well, there is a game that does that, and it was Ars Magica, and then it was then Mage the Ascension in the World of Darkness system, where it's very much a case of they came up with rotes as a magic fill-in to be the idea of, well, I don't want to be bothered with describing how I'm going to do this thing, but you could very much just say, I've got this sphere of magic, I've got this other sphere of magic, and I want to do an effect which uses them both. This is what I want to do. And then you'd have this conversation with the storyteller about, what the difficulty is and what you had to roll and how many successes you got. And I ran a campaign of that for a couple of years, and it started out really interesting with that, but it very quickly became, I want to do that thing I did before because I know what it can do. And we don't have to go into that whole system of how do I build this effect. Like some people were like, I'm going to try a new thing because I've advanced in this level and now I can do this new thing. But it takes a very special set of players that are willing to just, I want to explore what this magic could be as opposed to I want to cast this spell from this list.
It's that classic sort of TV show problem of they gave the characters this piece of technology in season 2. Why aren't they using it to solve all the problems in season 5? Right?
Yeah.
Well, shit. I feel like we could just fucking keep going, but
totally could.
We've got a good framework, and I think there could be a part 2 of this conversation where we circle back about some of this stuff, and maybe we talk. A fun way to do this would sit down and do like a couple mini session zeros where we pretend we're about to start a game, and then think about what kind of system we would want and how we would modify it. And that could be kind of a fun way to do a follow-up for something like this, kind of put that into practice.
Yeah.
I'm nodding my head.
But
absolutely
good radio. But short of that,
just add some Foley.
No Foley requests. So short of that, just kind of one round going around the table. Any kind of final thoughts you had? Any questions or comments you wanted to bring up or mention?
One thing that I always love in big fantasy epic movies and stuff like that is like epic war scenes. And I really have never found a role-playing game that does that well without bogging it down into a lot of tiny little details. If anyone knows of a good system, please let me know.
Matt Colville, MCDM, has their Kingdoms in Warfare rules. I'll bring it in next time we sit down.
Wow,
Do you work for him?
Yeah.
No, but you know what? He
Pull
makes
off that mask.
MCDM makes MCDM
Like a
makes.
Scooby-Doo show.
Listen,
What were you saying?
MCDM makes great products, and Matt Colville has been playing D&D for a long time, and he's very vocal about the things he likes about it. He's very vocal about the things he doesn't like about it, and he is very transparent in the way that he describes the what he is doing, but also why. And it's great. He's awesome to listen to, and you can see his passion in the products. He's a writer by trade, so like he wants that drama, that tension, that rising and falling action. Doesn't want to get bogged down in the rules.
Didn't he help write 5e?
No.
Is he the one that did the expanded like monsters?
Yeah,
Yep,
the
okay.
Flea Mortals, which is upcoming.
that's the one.
But he's done Kingdoms and Warfare, Strongholds and Followers was
Okay.
another one that he did.
I'll check it out.
But it's just D&D content. They're actually making their own RPG system. I don't work for them, but
Yet.
you know, yeah. But when you find people in the industry that are making, that are, what's the word? They're creating new things, new ideas, novel ideas, and not just taking things that are old and sort of changing this and that. We were talking earlier. This Andrew's saying it's this old system bogged down and. This edition, that edition, we have to keep this because this is D&D, quote unquote, where there are people who don't think like that. And I think, giving those people more attention and supporting those people will make the hobby better.
Word.
I think kind of what we just hinted at too, possibly as a second part to this first podcast would be that, or this roundtable, I should say, is that the best fantasy system for anyone looking to play in one is the one that you and your players agree on, right? So the session 0, define the
What we
idea and what you want and the shape of it, not the details, but the shape of it, and then go from there and see what system applies to it. Jake was just talking about this before we started, is that we often have approached running games by saying we want to run a spycraft game or a Star Wars game, and rather than saying like this is the story we want to tell, which system best fits it. So we have to do our own homework too.
I don't have much to add, actually. I think that we've covered off so much stuff, but I would totally echo that sentiment, that it does come down to, you just want to have fun, right?
Yeah.
And whether you want to have a game, because you're right, rolling dice is fun. So sometimes you just want to let them be the arbiter and not have to do some heavy pondering about where this scene should go and is it epic or dramatic. And sometimes when you roll a natural 1, it's just great because this untoward thing happens that you can then turn into a plot point.
Wild
Same thing
magic.
with natural 20. Wild magic. Yeah, I've never actually seen that happen.
Yeah, neither have we.
But no, I don't think that this is a conversation that would ever really end if you gave it the chance, because there's just so much to talk about.
Matt, anything to add, sir?
No, I think there was. I think there's a lot of great points. Lots of stuff for me to think about. New systems to check out, and maybe try to pick and choose from, and add to future stories of mine. Because I think the most fun I've had at being a DM is not looking at the rule book as a hard set of rules, is more like guidelines to tell the story. And if the rules don't fit the kind of story I'm telling, then, I'll find something that does, I think actually the campaign that I ran for you guys, I used elements of 4E in there, because I was like, I want you guys to have to do this thing, but there really isn't a mechanic in 5E for that isn't just like basic. It added more. So I think be open about what you can do. Have fun.
So grappling is a huge part of your game.
That was 3.5.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was a lot more thrashing, grappling and thrashing.
Played 3.5 for 15 years. Still had to look up the grappling rules.
There's a lot more mauling in your. Or,
Don't
or
remember.
ratting
Still
in
don't
there.
remember the grappling rules.
No, but I think I remember it's like page 160 something. I remember that, but I don't remember the rules.
164, I want to say.
Yeah, this has been awesome, guys. And I just will say, I guess mostly speaking for Jake and Dan, who I've had the longest background with, these conversations benefit so much from other perspectives. So
Yeah.
having Devin and Andrew and Matt, even though you've mostly played with us, you still bring a very different outlook and kind of background to it. So I want to thank you guys. Had a great chat. And again, for listeners, if you want to hear more from Andrew, check out the This Is Not Happening, another X-Files podcast, which is fantastic. And you can find them on YouTube if you look up Crush Improv. They might be playing some D&D here or there.
Yeah.
And yeah, we'll have to have you back again. So
It would be my pleasure. It's fun talking to you guys.
that's it, guys. See you later.
Have a good one.
Bye.
Peace.
Cool.
Grappling is 155 FI.
Oh,
3.5 book right here.
First you initiate the grapple.
Police car and a screaming siren, pneumatic drill, ripped up concrete, a baby wailing, stray dog howling, a screech of brakes and lamp lights blinking. That's entertainment. That's entertainment. Smash of glass and the rumble of boots, electric train and a ripped up phone booth, exploded walls and the cry of a tomcat. What's going out and a kick in the balls? I said that's entertainment. That's entertainment. Days of speed and slow time Mondays, listen now with rain on a boring Wednesday, watching the news and not eating your tea, freezing cold flats and death on the walls. I said that's entertainment. That's entertainment.
That's nasty.